In late May 1942, the Pacific Ocean shimmered like a mirror, vast and silent. From horizon to horizon, there was no sign of the enemy, only the rhythmic pulse of the waves and the faint hum of engines cutting through the endless blue. To the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it felt as though the world itself bowed before their rising sun. 6 months had passed since the stunning victory at Pearl Harbor. Japan's navy had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The empire had never been stronger. From the decks of the mighty carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailors and pilots believed the war's end was already written. Japan, they said, was destined to rule Asia and the Pacific for 1,000 years. At the center of it all stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet. Calm, precise, and burdened with vision, he understood something most of his subordinates refused to see. Yamamoto had studied in America. He knew its factories, its steel, its will. He knew that Japan's triumph at Pearl Harbor was not the end, but the beginning of a dangerous storm. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," he once said, and filled him with a terrible resolve. But even knowing that, Yamamoto had no choice but to act. The empire demanded another decisive blow, one that would crush American morale and force them to negotiate peace. The target was Midway Atoll, a tiny, strategic island halfway between Hawaii and Japan. Seizing it would draw out what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan would destroy them once and for all. Preparations began in secret. The operation was codenamed MI. In Tokyo's naval headquarters, officers pored over maps, calculating tides, flight ranges, and fuel consumption. Messages flashed through encrypted radio channels using the JN-25 code, which Japan believed unbreakable. The fleet's movements were hidden under layers of deception, or so they thought. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's best aviation tacticians, briefed the air crews. The hangars echoed with his voice and the clatter of tools as mechanics tuned engines and loaded bombs. "We will strike at dawn," he told them. "Our enemy will come to defend Midway. When he does, we shall finish what we began at Pearl Harbor." The pilots nodded, their faces young, confident, and unshaken by doubt. Many carried small good luck charms from their families, tucked into flight suits beside photographs of loved ones. None suspected they were flying toward one of the greatest reversals in naval history. On the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo studied the sea with his binoculars. He was a cautious commander, loyal but uncertain. Yamamoto's plan demanded perfect timing and absolute surprise. Nagumo feared that such perfection rarely existed in war. Still, orders were orders. Meanwhile, the decks buzzed with activity. Sailors fueled aircraft under the hot Pacific sun. Bombs and torpedoes were carefully hoisted aboard. Pilots ran final checks. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and salt, the scent of both power and vulnerability. Somewhere in the distance, a sailor began to sing softly, his voice carried by the wind. Far above, the weather was clear, too clear. It was perfect flying weather, but also perfect for being spotted. The Americans, they believed, were still in Hawaii, too far to interfere. What they did not know was that U.S. intelligence had already broken their code. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his cryptographers at Station HYPO had discovered that AF, Japan's target, was Midway. American carriers were already sailing east, ready to spring the trap on their hunters. On June 2nd, the Japanese fleet steamed eastward in majestic formation. Carriers glided like floating fortresses, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The sea glimmered under the crimson flag of the rising sun. Officers spoke with quiet pride. Their empire was at its zenith. As night fell, the decks dimmed under the soft glow of red lights. Pilots wrote letters they would never send. Mechanics slept beside their planes. The ship rocked gently, its massive engines humming below decks like a living creature. From his cabin, Nagumo could hear the sound of the ocean, steady, eternal, and wondered how much of the war would be decided by luck, not planning. Thousands of kilometers away, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato cruised in the distant rear of the operation. The world's largest battleship, armed with 18-inch guns. It was a symbol of Japanese strength. Yet Yamamoto himself sat in silence, reading over intelligence reports. Something gnawed at him, the thought that the Americans might know more than they should. But pride and momentum drove him forward. To call off the operation now would be unthinkable. The following dawn, as the horizon glowed orange, the carriers launched their first reconnaissance planes. The sound of engines shattered the morning calm. Aircraft rose one by one into the sky, circling like hawks. From above, the ocean looked infinite, empty, the kind of emptiness that hides danger. Below, on Akagi's bridge, Nagumo received his first reports. No enemy sighted. He allowed himself a rare smile. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. On the hangar deck, mechanics refueled and rearmed the returning bombers for the next strike. Rows of high-explosive bombs waiting, torpedoes gleaming under lantern light. The men moved quickly, efficiently, unaware that within hours, those very bombs would turn their ship into an inferno. At that moment, far beyond the horizon, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were closing in, silent shadows on the sea. The Japanese sailors felt confident, even invincible. They had not yet heard the sound that would haunt them forever, the high-pitched scream of American dive bombers descending from the clouds. For now, there was only the sea, the wind, and the illusion of control. As the sun climbed higher, the sky over the Pacific remained deceptively peaceful. The calm was perfect, and it would not last. The morning of June 3, 1942, broke with an eerie calm. The Pacific stretched endlessly under a silver mist. The horizon blurred where sky and sea became one. To the sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it felt like sailing through a dream, the kind that carried both pride and foreboding. From the towering bridge of the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo watched the ocean with a practiced eye. His fleet, the most powerful armada ever assembled by Japan, moved in flawless formation. For aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu cut through the water like blades. They were escorted by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and supply ships, stretching over the horizon in perfect order. Each carried men who believed they were sailing toward glory. At the center of the operation stood the heart of Japan's naval aviation, more than 200 aircraft ready to strike. The decks gleamed under the morning light as ground crews checked engines, fueled planes, and armed torpedoes. The smell of oil, metal, and salt filled the air. Pilots stood in small groups, smoking quietly, tightening gloves, and adjusting flight goggles. They were young, most in their 20s, hardened by victories across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. They had never lost a major battle. But as Akagi's engines rumbled and her bow cut through the waves, even the most confident among them could feel something strange. A tension that didn't belong to the sea or the sky, but to fate itself. Far to the north, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship, the colossal Yamato, followed at a cautious distance. He preferred to oversee from the rear, controlling the vast operation by radio. The Emperor's hopes and Japan's destiny rested on his shoulders. Yamamoto's goal was clear: lure the remaining American carriers into battle and annihilate them. Once Midway fell, Hawaii would be threatened next, and America would have no choice but to negotiate peace. The plan was bold, perhaps too bold. Yamamoto's intelligence officers believed the Americans were unaware of Japan's target. Their radio codes were considered unbreakable, but unknown to them, the Americans had already deciphered their messages. U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz had read the enemy's plans as if looking through a window. As the Japanese fleet moved east, the Americans were already waiting. On board the Akagi, the daily rhythm continued, efficient, mechanical, almost ceremonial. The crew woke at dawn, ate their rationed rice and fish, cleaned the decks, and prayed before the rising sun flag. In the hangar below, engineers worked in the dim light to service the Mitsubishi A6M0s and Nakajima torpedo bombers. Every bolt, every hose, every bomb was checked twice. "Precision is victory," said Captain Aoki, walking between the aircraft rows. "Every mistake is death." For the men, the war had long become routine. Yet tonight felt different. Conversations were quieter. Letters were written with more care. A few pilots confessed to uneasy dreams, dark seas, burning skies. "The spirits of Pearl Harbor are watching," one muttered. "We must not fail them." As dusk fell, the fleet slowed. The sky turned red, as if painted in blood. Sailors leaned against the railings, staring into the endless ocean. Some thought of home, of the cherry blossoms that had already fallen in Japan, of mothers and wives waiting for letters that might never come. Others watched the sky, whispering prayers to the ancestors. At 1900 hours, the order came from Yamamoto's command: proceed with Operation MI. Attack Midway at first light. The carriers turned into the wind. The sea grew darker. Below deck, the aircrew slept in narrow bunks beside their aircraft, lulled by the vibration of the engines. The sound was constant, deep, like a heartbeat. High above them, the stars appeared, thousands of cold points of light across the Pacific sky. On the bridge, Nagumo stood alone, his face pale under the glow of the instrument panels. He read Yamamoto's message again, then folded it carefully. His instincts told him the Americans were not far. Yet pride, duty, and the weight of command pressed him forward. By midnight, the fleet was 300 miles northwest of Midway. Radio silence was absolute. The ships moved like ghosts through the dark. The moonlight glinted on steel hulls and the red discs of the Japanese flags fluttering in the wind. In the engine rooms, men worked stripped to the waist, sweat mixing with oil as pistons thundered. The smell of machinery filled every corridor. The morning of June 3, 1942, broke with an eerie calm. The Pacific stretched endlessly under a silver mist. The horizon blurred where sky and sea became one. To the sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it felt like sailing through a dream, the kind that carried both pride and foreboding. From the towering bridge of the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo watched the ocean with a practiced eye. His fleet, the most powerful armada ever assembled by Japan, moved in flawless formation. For aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu cut through the water like blades. They were escorted by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and supply ships, stretching over the horizon in perfect order. Each carried men who believed they were sailing toward glory. At the center of the operation stood the heart of Japan's naval aviation, more than 200 aircraft ready to strike. The decks gleamed under the morning light as ground crews checked engines, fueled planes, and armed torpedoes. The smell of oil, metal, and salt filled the air. Pilots stood in small groups, smoking quietly, tightening gloves, and adjusting flight goggles. They were young, most in their 20s, hardened by victories across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. They had never lost a major battle. But as Akagi's engines rumbled and her bow cut through the waves, even the most confident among them could feel something strange. A tension that didn't belong to the sea or the sky, but to fate itself. Far to the north, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship, the colossal Yamato, followed at a cautious distance. He preferred to oversee from the rear, controlling the vast operation by radio. The Emperor's hopes and Japan's destiny rested on his shoulders. Yamamoto's goal was clear: lure the remaining American carriers into battle and annihilate them. Once Midway fell, Hawaii would be threatened next, and America would have no choice but to negotiate peace. The plan was bold, perhaps too bold. Yamamoto's intelligence officers believed the Americans were unaware of Japan's target. Their radio codes were considered unbreakable, but unknown to them, the Americans had already deciphered their messages. U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz had read, "Dawn crept over the endless blue horizon like a ghost rising from the sea." The Japanese fleet cut across the calm waters, its massive carriers leaving white trails that stretched toward eternity. The morning air was heavy with the smell of salt and burning fuel, and the low hum of engines vibrated through steel decks like a heartbeat. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, his binoculars scanning the horizon. He saw nothing, only the sea, endless and empty. Yet somewhere beyond that still horizon, he knew the Americans were waiting. The question was where. It was June 4th, 1942. Operation MI, the attack on Midway, was entering its second phase. The first wave of Japanese aircraft had already thundered off the decks hours earlier, led by Lieutenant Tominaga's squadrons. They had dawn crept over the endless blue horizon like a ghost rising from the sea. The Japanese fleet cut across the calm waters, its massive carriers leaving white trails that stretched toward eternity. The morning air was heavy with the smell of salt and burning fuel, and the low hum of engines vibrated through steel decks like a heartbeat. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, his binoculars scanning the horizon. He saw nothing, only the sea, endless and empty. Yet somewhere beyond that still horizon, he knew the Americans were waiting. The question was where. It was June 4th, 1942. Operation MI, the attack on Midway, was entering its second phase. The first wave of Japanese aircraft had already thundered off the decks hours earlier, led by Lieutenant Tominaga's squadrons. They had bombed Midway Island, setting fuel tanks ablaze and tearing through hangars. But reports from the returning pilots told a different story. The island wasn't destroyed. American anti-aircraft fire had been fierce, and more than a dozen planes had failed to return. Nagumo frowned. This wasn't supposed to happen. Midway was supposed to be a soft target, easily crushed under Japan's might. Instead, it was fighting back, hard. "Admiral," said his air officer, Commander Kasaka, holding a decoded message. "Tominaga requests a second strike to finish the job." Nagumo hesitated. The carrier's decks were filled with aircraft being rearmed, some with torpedoes, some with bombs. To switch weapons now would take over an hour. And if American ships appeared during that time, the fleet would be vulnerable. He turned to the lookout officer. "Any word from the scout planes?" The man shook his head. "Nothing yet, sir. No enemy sighted." Nagumo's jaw tightened. 8 reconnaissance planes had been launched at dawn, long-range Kawanishi flying boats and a few Nakajima B-5NS modified for scouting. But the vastness of the Pacific made the task almost impossible. Even 100 planes could miss an enemy fleet by a few miles. And one of those scout planes, the one launched from the cruiser Tone, had left 30 minutes late due to a mechanical failure. That delay would change history. High above the ocean, hidden by thin clouds, that scout plane finally reached its patrol line. Its pilot, Ensign Amari, scanned the waters below through a pair of binoculars. For hours, he saw nothing but waves. Then, at 0728, a shape glimmered far below, a dark speck against the glittering sea. He squinted. It was moving fast. Then another shape appeared, and another. His heart began to race. "Ships." He grabbed the radio and began tapping out a coded message. "Sighted 10 enemy ships. Bearing 10 degrees. Distance 240 miles." The message crackled through the static to the Akagi. But the wording was unclear. Were these warships or transports? Nagumo's staff debated fiercely. Some believed it was a small escort group protecting Midway. Others feared it might be an American carrier force. Nagumo couldn't decide. He needed confirmation. "Order the scout to identify the ships," he commanded. The minutes ticked by. The air in the command center grew thick. Every decision now could mean life or death for thousands. Below deck, armorers worked feverishly, loading bombs onto aircraft that had just been rearmed for a second strike on Midway. The hangars were crowded with machinery, the smell of gasoline and sweat choking the air. At 0755, the scout plane sent another message. One carrier present. The words hit like thunder. An American carrier here. Nagumo froze for a second. His mind raced. Should he launch the planes immediately, even though their weapons were wrong for ship attacks? Or should he take time to rearm them again with torpedoes? The decks were chaos. Planes halfway armed, fuel lines snaking across the floor, bombs being rolled out, torpedoes waiting. One spark, one mistake, and the entire ship could erupt into fire. "Prepare to change armaments," Nagumo ordered finally. "We will attack the enemy fleet." As the crews scrambled, the sound of distant engines reached them. Faint at first, then growing. Lookouts shouted. A squadron of small black dots appeared on the horizon. American bombers. Sirens wailed. Gunners rushed to their stations. Tracers lit up the sky as the first U.S. attack planes dove from the clouds. Most were quickly shot down, falling in flames to the sea. The Japanese cheered. But it was only the beginning. In the chaos, the flight decks became a deadly trap. Bombs, fuel hoses, and aircraft crowded every corner. Pilots waited in the cockpits, engines idling, unaware that disaster was minutes away. At 0920, another Japanese scout reported more enemy ships, including 2 additional carriers. Nagumo's blood ran cold. The Americans were here in full force. Meanwhile, far above the clouds, unseen and silent, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had found the Japanese fleet. They were guided not by radar but by luck and courage. The hidden eyes of the Pacific were about to reveal everything. From the Akagi's bridge, Nagumo stared into the sky, searching for the unseen. The ocean glittered under the sunlight, calm and beautiful. Then came the sound, faint whistles growing into screams.
Diva bombes.
Blue-gray shapes burst through the clouds, wings folded, sunlight flashing on their bellies. Alarms blared. The gunners opened fire, the sky turning into a storm of tracers. But it was too late. At 10:26, the first bomb struck Kaga. Seconds later, Soryu erupted in flames. Then the Akagi herself took a direct hit through her flight deck. The explosion tore through the hangar, igniting fuel and torpedoes. The ship shuddered, engulfed in fire. Men screamed. Smoke filled the air. From a distance, the sea looked like it was on fire. In less than 10 minutes, 3 of Japan's proudest carriers, the first light of June 4, 1942, crept over the Pacific, painting the clouds in soft pink and gold. But for the men aboard the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, there was no peace in that sunrise. It was the beginning of a battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. As the rising sun glimmered on the steel decks, Japanese pilots tightened the straps of their flight gear, the air heavy with the metallic scent of fuel and salt. At exactly 4:30 a.m., the first waves of aircraft roared into the dawn, their engines screaming as they climbed into the sky. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, watched with pride as his country's finest soared eastward. "This will be the end of American resistance in the Pacific," one officer whispered. The fleet moved with confidence. To the Japanese, Midway was merely a stepping stone toward Hawaii, and from there, dominance of the Pacific Ocean. But beneath that same sky, far away to the east, American scouts were already in motion. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, 3 fragile giants, had taken positions northeast of Midway. Their decks were alive with controlled chaos. Mechanics arming Dauntless dive bombers, crews checking fuel lines, and pilots waiting for the command that would send them into history. Admiral Raymond Spruance, calm but calculating, looked through his binoculars and muttered, "Let them come." At 5:34 a.m., Japanese planes reached Midway Atoll. Bombs rained down on the tiny island, sending towers of smoke and flame into the sky. The Americans responded fiercely. Marine Corps fighters scrambled to intercept the attackers, their outdated Buffaloes and Wildcats diving headfirst into a wall of Japanese Zeros. The sky turned into a deadly ballet of fire and smoke. Many of the Marines never made it back, but their sacrifice forced the Japanese to delay their next wave. Meanwhile, American patrol planes were desperately scanning the horizon. Then, at 5:52 a.m., a PBY Catalina sighted something, a massive formation of Japanese ships. The message crackled over the radio. "Enemy fleet sighted." Those words set off a chain of events that would alter the course of the war. At 6:10 a.m., the order went out from Admiral Spruance: launch attack. Within minutes, the flight decks of the American carriers were roaring with life. Dozens of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters were being prepared. Pilots exchanged brief, grim nods. Many knew the odds were against them. The Japanese had superior fighters, more experienced pilots, and tightly coordinated fleets. But the Americans had one advantage the enemy didn't expect: surprise. As the first squadrons lifted into the morning sky, the ocean below reflected the flames still burning on Midway. The pilots flew in silence, their hearts pounding. "Remember Pearl Harbor?" one of them muttered over the radio. Above them, the sun climbed higher, and the wind carried the smell of burning oil and salt. At 7:15 a.m., the American torpedo bombers, slow, unarmored, and underarmed, found the Japanese fleet. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of the USS Hornet, the men of Torpedo Squadron 8 pressed on through swarms of Zero fighters. They had no fighter cover. One by one, their planes were torn apart, falling in flames into the ocean. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Of the 15 planes that launched, only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating for hours in the wreckage as the battle raged on around him. But the sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese carriers, forced to maneuver and rearm their planes mid-operation, were caught in chaos when the next wave arrived. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. From 20,000 feet above, the dauntless bombers dove like hawks, the wind screaming past their canopies. Below, the Japanese carriers were wide open, their decks loaded with fully armed planes and fuel lines exposed. The moment of destiny had come. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, spotted a glint of sunlight reflecting off a destroyer and followed its wake straight to the heart of the enemy fleet. "We've found them," he said quietly. Then, pushing his stick forward, he dove. Bombs whistled through the air, followed by explosions that tore through the Japanese carriers. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupted into towering infernos. Pilots running across their decks were engulfed by fire. Officers shouted frantic orders, but it was too late. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was burning. By 10:30 a.m., 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were crippled. Only Hiryu remained operational, and her pilots struck back fiercely, damaging the Yorktown. But American bombers found her soon after and sent her to the same fiery grave as her sisters. As the sun reached its peak, the Pacific was littered with smoke, flames, and the wreckage of once mighty ships. The ocean that had been Japan's highway to victory now reflected only destruction. The wings of fire that had once brought terror from the skies had met their match in courage, sacrifice, and fate. That morning, the Japanese Empire's advance was stopped. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. The men who fought that day on both sides would never forget the moment when dawn brought not just light. The morning of June 4, 1942, had ended with smoke and fire stretching across the endless Pacific. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were gone, burning wrecks on the sea. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the lone surviving carrier, Hiryu, staring into the gray haze on the horizon. His fleet had been caught off guard, punished by an enemy they believed crippled at Pearl Harbor. Yet even in defeat, the Japanese spirit refused to break. Nagumo's men were preparing a counterstrike. Below decks, Hiryu's hangars buzzed with activity. Mechanics worked feverishly, rearming and refueling the few remaining aircraft. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and oil, the metallic clang of tools echoing through the steel walls. Among the pilots was Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, a seasoned aviator who had once led attacks on Wake Island. His aircraft, a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, sat ready. Though short on fuel and wounded from an earlier mission, Tominaga insisted on leading the next wave. "We must show the Emperor that Japan still fights," he said quietly to his crew. At 2:30 p.m., Hiryu launched her counterattack. The sun glared off the ocean as 18 dive bombers and 6 torpedo planes climbed into the sky. They were heading straight for the Yorktown, the American carrier that had already survived 1 torpedo and several near misses. On board the Yorktown, sailors scrambled to patch the damage from the morning's engagement. The smell of burnt paint and smoke still lingered when lookouts shouted, "Enemy planes inbound!" Alarms blared. Anti-aircraft gunners ran to their stations, sweat pouring down their faces as they loaded shells into hot barrels. The sea around the Yorktown erupted in geysers of water as the first bombs fell. One hit near the bow, another smashed into the flight deck, igniting fires that roared through the ship. The carrier shuddered, her decks buckling. Inside, men worked desperately to contain the flames. Despite the damage, Yorktown's crew managed to keep her afloat. Her gunners, still firing, brought down several attacking planes, but not before one final torpedo tore into her side, stopping her dead in the water. Back aboard Hiryu, cheers erupted as the surviving pilots returned, reporting that Yorktown was sinking and burning. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding the carrier, bowed his head in pride and exhaustion. "We have avenged our brothers," he said softly, but his victory was short-lived. At 3:30 p.m., American scout planes had already located Hiryu. Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard the Enterprise, wasted no time. "Launch all available bombers," he ordered. The last surviving Japanese carrier was now the target of the combined fury of the U.S. Navy. The sun hung low as 32 dauntless dive bombers soared through the clouds toward Hiryu. Below, the carrier cut through the waves, her flight deck crowded with refueling planes for the next strike. The Japanese lookouts spotted the enemy too late. The scream of diving bombers tore through the air.
Diva bombes.
Incoming from the east. The warning came seconds before the first bomb struck. One explosion ripped through the forward deck, another through the hangar below, where fuel and torpedoes were being loaded. Fire erupted instantly, racing across the deck like a living thing. The heat became unbearable. Men threw themselves overboard to escape the inferno. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship. Standing on the bridge amid the flames, he saluted his crew. "We die together," he said. As the order to abandon ship echoed below, he and Captain Kaku refused evacuation. Moments later, a final explosion tore Hiryu apart, sending the ship and her proud commander into the depths. By nightfall, the Pacific was eerily quiet. The once invincible Japanese carrier strike force had been annihilated. 4 of their finest carriers, the same ones that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now lay beneath the waves. Only a handful of destroyers and cruisers survived to pick up survivors. But victory had come at a heavy cost for both sides. The Yorktown, though still afloat, was mortally wounded. As tugs attempted to tow her away, Japanese submarines, silent predators beneath the waves, moved in. On June 6, the submarine I-168 found its prey. A torpedo streaked through the dark water, slamming into Yorktown's hull. The great ship groaned, tilted, and slowly slipped beneath the surface. The Americans watched in silence as the carrier disappeared into the deep, a grim reminder that the unseen enemy still had teeth. As the fires of Hiryu faded and the last survivors drifted on the waves, the scale of the battle became clear. Japan had lost 4 carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The United States had lost 1 carrier, but gained something far greater: momentum. The once unseen enemy had struck back from the shadows, but in doing so, it revealed its vulnerability. The Pacific, once dominated by the rising sun, was beginning to tilt toward a new dawn. The Battle of Midway was not merely a clash of steel and fire. It was the turning point of a war that would rage for 3 more years. For those who fought and died that day, the ocean itself became their monument. Beneath the waves, the ghosts of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and Yorktown still rest, silent witnesses to the day when the unseen enemy struck back and the tide of history changed forever.